Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Moore. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, here in Prague, Czech Republic, on the 22nd day of July, 2017. It's really a pleasure to be here. We'll start from the beginning. 51 years ago, young John Moore, 19 years old, knew that he was headed for the Army and headed for Vietnam. So he enlisted for the option of going into military intelligence. I graduated from military intelligence school, went to Vietnam where I worked in psychological warfare for a year, came back to the States, was in Special Forces the last year of my Army career, active duty, left the Army and became a paralegal. So that's twice that I had formal education to train and discipline my brain to basically become a research tool. After becoming a paralegal, it was only 8 or 10 months later, I was recruited to become a private detective. I was only doing that 3 or 4 months when I was recruited once again to become a criminal defense investigator at the age of 25. I investigated my first homicide at the age of 25 in the fall of 1973, a double homicide. I spent most of my adult life investigating crimes, homicides, burglaries, rapes, armed robberies, and so forth, as a criminal defense investigator. A lot of civil investigations also along the way. 17 years ago, the year 2000, I was working my dream job. Many of you have probably seen the film The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen. That movie was based on a book written by the man I was working for, Mr. Charles Shaw, who was captured and escaped from German POW camps 5 times during World War II. It was a good life at the time. I had always one murder case in my inventory of cases, a number of other criminal cases. The late winter, early spring of 2000, 2 friends of mine approached me separately, and one didn't know the other was going to do it, and they started telling me about this something called NIBIRU-Planet X, Wormwood, the destroyer. I listened to them patiently, and I thought, well, I didn't say this, but I thought, man, you guys need tinfoil hats really bad. This is crazy stuff. But I knew these men well enough that I should go ahead and check it out. So I talked to a friend of mine who is an outside vendor for the lettered government agencies, U.S. government agencies, and I told him about this. He basically told me I needed a tinfoil hat. He said, John, I'll check it out. I'll get back with you. About 4 weeks later, he got back with me. He says, John, it's exactly what you said it is. The federal government of the United States has known about this since 1979. They've been getting ready for it since 1979. Yes, it is true. That's when I began my personal research in year 2000. I did the thing many of you are interested in Planet X and NIBIRU have been doing for years. I found out about Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky, Zechariah Sitchin. I became friends with my friend Professor James McCanny. And I'm researching and I'm learning a lot. The same things that many people learn. The summer of 2007, something else happened. I was having lunch with a friend who served with the U.S. Navy submarines, and I'm telling him about NIBIRU and Planet X, and he starts telling me about a classified briefing he attended in the U.S. Navy in 1985. At that briefing, he was told the following: gentlemen, during your lifetimes, these oceans will come out of their banks, flooding all coastal areas worldwide. And when it comes time to retire from the U.S. Navy, you just might want to retire in the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks, in the center of the United States, as one of the known safe havens, which many thousands of Navy veterans, especially submarine veterans, have done. There's something called synchronicity, and synchronicity started kicking in a matter of weeks. It was only 3 or 4 weeks after that meeting that I was invited to speak to a college group in Rolla, Missouri. My friend, the college professor, was teaching a class on international relations. He asked me to come and speak to the group on terrorism, and I agreed to do so. He didn't tell me there would be a second presenter there. The other presenter was a retired intelligence officer from one of the U.S. Armed Forces. And we did our presentation. We finished and went to a pizza parlor in Rolla, Missouri, and we're talking. I'm sitting here, it's a four-top table, his wife's next to me, the intelligence officer's here, my friend, the college professor, sitting over here. During our conversation, I found out he did a 3-year tour of duty with the Navy Submarine Corps. Well, then I knew I had to ask the question. I never met this man before in my life. I may never see him again. I asked him the question, tell me what you know about rising ocean levels. Before he can speak up, his wife sitting next to me says the following. She says, John, we're at our last duty station at the Pentagon. We're getting ready to retire. We need to pick a place to retire. We picked the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks as our retirement home. I immediately made an appointment to meet him at a restaurant the following week and start making the second revisions. My friend I met with 4 weeks before started making the original Navy map. This gentleman helped me make the second revisions. Synchronicity again. It was only 3 or 4 more weeks. I was teaching a Missouri concealed carry class where people get training to carry pistols concealed. And I asked my students if anybody was a veteran. One man raised his hand. He was a veteran of the United States Navy Submarine Corps. I made an appointment with him the following week. I said, Steve, I can tell his name because he's now deceased. Many submarine veterans get way too much radiation and they're always getting cancer. I said, Steve, tell me what you know about rising ocean levels. He says, John, I've been out of the Navy 3 years. I signed a 5-year non-disclose agreement. If I tell you what I know, I could lose my pension. Okay, Steve. Can you blink your eyes once for yes and twice for no? And he smiled and laughed, and we went ahead in our conversations. He made the third and final revisions on that map, the map that's on my DVD, Global Warming, What the Government Isn't Telling You. Is it going to be on the screen? I hope. Everything's at my website, by the way. My website is thelibertyman.com. That's thelibertyman.com. It wasn't long after those interviews that I made the first disc that's on my 2 DVD set. And we posted that image of that map on that DVD. I took delivery of the first run of those DVDs, and I was at a fundraiser. We had a client charged with first-degree murder. It was a cold case. It had happened 25 years before. And it was being sponsored by the Western Cherokee Nation, American Indians, because our client was Cherokee. So it's a beautiful late summer, early fall day, beautiful weather, live music, great food, everybody's having a good time. I see a gentleman walking around with this official-looking ID badge. It says, Tim Spencer, Director, Emergency Preparedness, Western Cherokee Nation. So I strike up a conversation with him. And we're talking about a lot of things, mostly to do with preparedness and safety and all those related topics. And I decided I would give him a copy of my DVD. So he takes it. He calls me up a week later. And I barely know this man. We've since become very close friends. He's now become my webmaster and co-host with me on my radio show. He calls me up a week later and says, John, I watched your DVD. I said, okay. John, I've seen that map before. Now, I didn't know at the time that he was a veteran of the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps. He says, John, I was in New Orleans. I was doing classified work for the Navy. I walked across the hall to get a cup of coffee. And there's that map on the wall. Your map is on the wall. So he talks to a Master Chief. A Master Chief at that time would have been old enough to be his father. Tim Spencer would have been 21, 22 years old. The Master Chief was probably 43, 45 years old, somewhere in there. Master Chief, what is this map? The Master Chief says, young sailor, all you need to know is the white areas. The white areas are the safe areas. When you retire from the Navy, you want to live in the white area. That's the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks. Now, at the time, Tim Spencer wasn't told why there was a designated white area and what those other markings on the map meant. He was just told that was a safe area. His assumption was there was going to be a nuclear attack on the United States, and that would be a safe area. It was many decades later when he found out the real reason. It was maybe 6 or 8 months later. Tim Spencer is a student of mine in my concealed carry class, along with his wife, Laurie. And we're having lunch, and we're talking about different things, and Laurie says the following. Now, Laurie and Tim are both from Central Florida. Laurie says, John, I don't like cold weather, I don't like snow, I don't like Missouri, but we're here because of that darn map. When Tim Spencer left the Navy, he moved to the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks because of the map. I had a man call me up late winter, early spring of 2009. He had bought my DVD, he watched it, he was living in Montana. And he told me the following. He says, John, I watched your DVD. I said, okay. He says, John, I've seen that map before. I said, really? He says, yeah, really. This is important. He says, it was 1979. I was a young sailor stationed in New Orleans. I got the assignment to set up a briefing room, the chairs, the lights, the sound system. And there was this map on the wall. It had these strange markings on it. It was your map, John. He says, I wasn't allowed to be in the briefing room. It was a Saturday morning briefing for admirals, flag rank officers. He says, John, admirals don't do Saturday morning briefings. So these men show up, they're smoking cigars, telling jokes, how's the wife, how's the family, and they go in the briefing room, which had a closed door guarded by an officer. They don't guard doors with officers. It's almost always a Master Chief. When they came out of the briefing, no more joking, no more cigar smoking. They all looked like their puppy dogs had just died. Very morose. 1979 was also the year, the best I can tell, that the Pioneer 10 space probe found NIBIRU-Planet X. Now, most of astronomy is not looking at stars. Most of astronomy is mathematics. Yes, they do look at stars and they take lots of photographs. But most of astronomy is mathematics. And they've known since about 1900, 1908, somewhere along in there, that something very far out in space, very big, was causing these planets to perturbate when they got to a certain point. They would do that wobble, that perturbation. So they did their mathematical calculations. They knew if they went out in a certain direction far enough, they would find what was causing that. And they did. 1979. They've been tracking it ever since. When people hear a lecture like this, they want to hear about credentials. I'm not a scientist. I played football in high school. I'm no scientist. I'm a homicide detective. But I'm a pretty smart guy, and I've met some interesting people, and I found some interesting information. And then when it comes to looking at stars, let's talk about some credentials. Dr. Robert Harrington. Dr. Harrington was the supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory. Now, if you're going to draw a paycheck for looking at stars, is there any more upward mobility once you've become the supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory? Where else can your career go? Write books, make lectures? I mean, I don't know. Dr. Harrington was was interviewed by Zecharia Sitchin in his office at the United States Naval Observatory. What's publicly available is a 10-minute clip from a 1-hour interview. I've talked to the producer. They said that since Mr. Sitchin died, there's family squabbles over the money in the estate and the copyright, who owns copyright to the full hour, which we may never see. The 10 minutes, however, appears on a DVD titled, Are We Alone in the Universe? Are We Alone in the Universe? That's the title of the DVD. So here's Dr. Harrington in his office at the United States Naval Observatory. Here's Zecharia Sitchin. Dr. Harrington confirms Zecharia Sitchin's work. He says, here's the orbit of the 10th planet, Nibiru, very close to the orbit that you found, Mr. Sitchin, in your studies. He describes its size, 5 to 7 times the size of Earth. He says it has a very large iron-nickel core, which gives it more effect as far as gravity and electromagnetic energy. That's what we call in my business as a homicide detective, smoking gun evidence. When I found that interview, I thought, man, I really got something now. It's very important, very important. There's different directions that this research has taken me. Things I found out that appear to be related. One thing I ask my audience frequently is, anybody seen Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, the entire thing? Most people won't admit to watching the whole thing. Some people will say I watched some of it. Some people say I never watched it. Al Gore's documentary has some science and some science fiction in it. Now, he does say that there will be violent rising of the ocean levels. He also says it'll be the middle of the century, which would be more or less 2050. That's a science fiction. It's going to be a lot sooner than that. Of course, another part of the science fiction is human activity affecting climate. That can't happen. One good-sized volcano in one day puts more of these so-called greenhouse gases in the atmosphere than all the human beings on Earth in 1 year. Just one good-sized volcano. That's a fiction. But it's part of the, what I call disinformation, to distract and obfuscate and get people to not pay attention to what's really going on. And they've been quite successful. There may be 1.5% of the adults on this planet, and that's pretty optimistic, that understand the real deal. Most people believe either that climate change is a consequence of human activity, or climate change is a natural, slow-moving process that we can't do anything about anyway. That's what most people believe most of the time. Reality is violent climate change is already here. There's a paper I'm going to mention, and I'm going to say it twice for the benefit of our interpreters here. It's a real catchy title. There's a free download on my website at thelibertyman.com. Paid for with American tax dollars. Here's the title, twice slowly. An abrupt climate change scenario and its implications for United States national security. Like I say, real catchy, right? An abrupt climate change scenario and its implications for United States national security. Oh, they got it up there. Good. Thank you. 21 pages. Published in 2003. 2 researchers were hired by the United States Department of Defense to research and publish what would happen if 2 possible future scenarios took place. The first scenario, the Gulf Stream slowing down dramatically, and the consequences of that. The second scenario, the Gulf Stream stopping completely, and the consequences of that. Ladies and gentlemen, once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you will find this to be 21 of the scariest pages you will ever read in your life, for the following reason. Now, in 2004, the paper was published in 2003. I first found it in 2004. We already knew in 2004 that the Gulf Stream had lost about half of its mass and velocity, give or take. The scientists at the time were believing that it would be maybe 20, 25 years in the future that the Gulf Stream would stop completely. It might be a good time to talk about what is the Gulf Stream. The scientists call the Gulf Stream, it's a mouthful for our interpreters once again, the North Atlantic Thermohaline Conveyor. The North Atlantic Thermohaline Conveyor. Benjamin Franklin gave it the name the Gulf Stream a couple of hundred years ago. Warm water that comes out of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean goes up the east coast of Florida, past Georgia, past South Carolina, gets to about Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, where it starts going, I'll do the opposite map, east by northeast towards England. And it did so for we don't know how many centuries, up until June 12, 2010. Now you want evidence? I know people here want evidence. And my entire adult life has been in the world of evidence. Here's the evidence. The United States Navy, every 24 hours, publishes a brand new map showing ocean surface temperatures. There's a link on my website to the U.S. Navy website. There'll be a warning that comes up, warning, warning, don't go here, your computer's going to explode, don't worry about it, it's not going to hurt your computer. Now they show the ocean surface temperatures in colors. Reds and yellows are warm, blues and dark blues and purples are cold. And you can see the Gulf Stream coming up the east coast of Florida, past Georgia, South Carolina, gets to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and it starts going towards the British Isles, which it does for 200 or 300 miles, does a little loop-to-loop, and it's over. No more Gulf Stream. I was introduced to Dr. Luigi Zangari, a PhD scientist living and working in Italy, in July of 2010. And once again, on my website at thelibertyman.com, we have 2 radio interviews. The third Friday and fourth Friday of July 2010, 1 hour each. The first interview, Dr. Zangari said the following: we believe the Gulf Stream stopped last month, we're not sure, we need to recheck our calculations. The following week, he verified, yes, in fact, the Gulf Stream stopped June 12, 2010. So what does this mean? We also found out something else. This was news to me. The Gulf Stream used to, past tense, the Gulf Stream used to regulate the jet stream. No matter where you are on Earth, 5 miles above your head is wind going 150, 200 miles an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's 3 jet streams: Northern Hemisphere, Equatorial, and Southern Hemisphere. The Gulf Stream used to regulate the jet stream, causing the jet stream to behave in a more or less predictable fashion. The jet stream has a tremendous amount of effect on our weather, especially precipitation and temperature. Now, I've interviewed and debriefed a number of men and women involved in growing grains in North America: wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, spelt, oats, all those grains. Every business has a business model. The business model for growing grains is one bad harvest, hurry 4 good ones. That's the business model for growing grains. Everything these grain growers do, the farmland they buy and lease, the equipment they buy and lease, the seed, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicide, the debt that they carry, everything they do is based on being able to service that debt and expecting one bad harvest for every 4 good ones. That cycle's broken. That cycle is over. Weather has become so erratic they can't count on very much at all as far as dependability of weather. Which means If a farmer doesn't own their land outright, doesn't own their $750,000 to $1 million worth of equipment outright, doesn't have a good stock of seed, they can be in trouble real quick. A lot of farmers are going out of business because of that. A lot of people are focused on, John, when's NIBIRU going to be here? That's understandable. In fact, 17 years ago, when I first found out about this, I made an appointment at a private observatory. I'm going to look and see this thing for myself. I'm going to look and find this thing. What do I know? You can only see it from the southern hemisphere, and even then, only in the infrared light spectrum. What's happening with the Gulf Stream is a consequence of the following. We were having a discussion at breakfast this morning briefly. First of all, salt water behaves differently than fresh water. Now, if you take a tank, I'll see if I can do this in meters, 3 meters by 3 meters by 100 meters. With salt water, that's maybe 50 degrees at the same salinity of the ocean, normal ocean salinity. If you inject under pressure a 4-inch volume of water at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, centigrade Fahrenheit thing, you have to excuse me, I don't have that figured out. That 4-inch blast of water will go all the way through that 100 meters intact because it develops a thermal barrier around it. If you start introducing fresh water into that tank, the ability of that thermal barrier to function gradually breaks down until it doesn't function at all. That's why the Gulf Stream broke, is because of reduced salinity in these oceans. A consequence of melting freshwater ice in Greenland, melting freshwater ice in the Antarctic. Now, the melting ice at the Arctic is floating seawater, so that doesn't change either the ocean levels or the salinity, either one. Doesn't matter. You may have seen recently in the news the massive ice shelf that broke off the Antarctic. And mainstream news reports on how much sea level is going to rise, which would be maybe 1 or 2 inches. Big so what? What they don't talk about is a reduction of salinity of the oceans. That's what they're not talking about. That's what's very important. Now, the North Atlantic thermohaline conveyor, the Gulf Stream, is only one of many ocean currents. Atlantic Ocean, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, Pacific, and so forth. Many ocean currents. And they're all being affected and all being disrupted by the reduced salinity of these oceans. Very important because it's changing our weather in very dramatic fashion. I want to talk a little bit about Immanuel Velikovsky. Now, at the end of my 2 DVD set, there's a bibliography with more than a dozen books. A 2 DVD set is 4 hours of lecture. What I'm doing is very abbreviated. The 4 hours is very abbreviated. Dr. Velikovsky was a medical doctor. He was not an archaeologist, but that was his hobby. That's what he loved to do. And he traveled around the planet to observe and find places where cataclysmic events had left evidence. Caves that had the jumbled bones of saber-toothed tigers and monkeys and elephants all jammed together as if they all died at the same time. One of the things Dr. Velikovsky did that no archaeologist had taken the time to do before was compare and correct the ancient calendars so that you could match up events. The ancient Chinese calendar, the South American calendar of the Mayans, Northern Europeans, the Egyptians, the Israelis. You can't line up events until and unless you line up calendars. Most of us know that when Moses was leaving Egypt, that the Nile River turned red. We know because of the Hebrew calendar when that happened. We also know because of Dr. Velikovsky that the calendar in China recorded the same event at the same time, the water in China turning red. We know because Dr. Velikovsky's work that the Mayans recorded their waters turning red, and the Northern Europeans the same thing. All the water on the planet turned red at the same time. Probably iron oxide, probably part of NIBIRU. Very important work. Dr. Velikovsky was hammered mercilessly, made fun of, marginalized. Everything the mainstream media and the powers that be could do to make sure people didn't pay attention to Dr. Velikovsky. Well, his work is still available, and I encourage people to read his work. It's very foundational. Zecharia Sitchin. And you take one look at Zecharia Sitchin and you say, yeah, there's a guy who spent 40 years in a library. I mean, he's got that scholarly look about him. He could pick up Babylonian and clay tablets and read them like we read the newspaper. Quite a talent. And it's very critical that he and Dr. Harrington got together for that interview. I'm so glad that happened, and they made a record. Dr. Harrington, not long after that interview, which was in the late 1980s, he announced publicly he was packing up equipment, and he's going to go to the Antarctic and see this thing for himself, which he did. He packed up his equipment, he went to the Antarctic, and 3 or 4 months later, he was dead from cancer. And when you see Dr. Harrington, he looks like he could be a former football player, a big, vigorous, tough guy. Pocket protector, thick eyeglasses, but a big, tough guy, healthy guy. Dead from cancer in 3 or 4 months. A lot of speculation about that, but there's no evidence to back up any of the speculation about the circumstances of his death. His research assistant, shortly after Dr. Harrington's death, said, I don't believe in Planet X or NIBIRU. I'm not going to do any more work in that area. He got the memo. He got the memo. The main focus and message I want to get to everybody watching this, and I was talking to one of the young ladies earlier, when I'm interviewed on a radio show or I got a journalist that wants to talk to me, they want a 2-paragraph response, a 2-paragraph answer to something that is incredibly complex. You can't properly respond. You cannot understand this matter in 2 paragraphs or 100 paragraphs or 100 pages. It takes a lot of diligence, a lot of research. Research from verifiable sources. Now, when the Department of Defense publishes a paper that they paid for, that's pretty good evidence. This is not something generated by somebody in their home. A real document, really paid for with American tax dollars. When you go to the U.S. Navy website and you see that map every 24 hours, that's real evidence. I'm a film buff, and there's some Hollywood films that have given us some messages. One is titled The Day After Tomorrow. The main premise of The Day After Tomorrow is the consequences of the Gulf Stream stopping. That's it. That's the main premise. Now, they allude to human activity causing violent climate change, which of course is silliness. At the beginning of the movie, near the beginning, there's 3 scientists on an island off the coast of Scotland, and their job, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is to monitor the buoys out in the North Atlantic that monitor and report back ocean surface temperatures. Now, because it's Hollywood, they show the consequences of the Gulf Stream stopping in just a matter of weeks, when in reality it takes years. But it's Hollywood and it's very dramatic. So these scientists are watching these buoys, and one reports a dramatic drop in temperature, then another, and finally, after an hour or so, all the buoys in the North Atlantic are reporting a dramatic drop in temperature. That's when the Gulf Stream stopped, right then. In the film, it's only a matter of weeks before a new ice age begins. Reality is that it's going to take much longer than that. Much longer. This has happened before. If you dig down through the permafrost in Alaska at the Arctic Circle, you find vegetation that it can only exist in tropical areas. That's pretty well known, pretty well understood. This has happened many times before. The topic of pole shifts comes up. When molten lava is coming out of the volcano and is flowing, as it cools down, just before it gets hard and becomes rock once again, the magnetic particles in that lava line up with magnetic north. Wherever magnetic north is, at that moment when that rock cools down and becomes solid, it lines up with magnetic north. So scientists can go back to volcanoes, 500-year-old, 1,000-year-old, 20,000-year-old volcanoes, and they can find out where magnetic north was when that lava cooled down 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 years ago. It doesn't matter. And magnetic north has been in many different places. Many. This is real science and easily verifiable. Most of these pole shifts are generally 12, 15 degrees. It may not sound like much, but it's a lot. The next one, I believe, will be dramatically greater than that, possibly as much as 45 degrees. And that's, a lot of that part of science is what I might call educated speculation. Quite frankly, it is. It's enough to know that it's going to happen, and we do know that it's happened many times in the past. Many times. This one will be a devastating one. Most people on this planet will die. At least 9 out of 10, maybe 95 out of 100. I don't know. Most people on this planet live within, see if I can do kilometers, 100 kilometers of an ocean, 150 kilometers of an ocean. That's that way in the United States. Most people live on the East Coast and the West Coast and the Gulf Coast. The middle of the country where I live doesn't have nearly as many people. These are the areas that will be dramatically affected, devastated underwater. A friend of mine was on a vacation out west, I think in Arizona, and he climbed to the top of one of these mesas. We've all seen the photographs of the mesas in the westerns, these rock formations that are flat on top. He climbed to the top of one of these mesas, and he says, "John, there's seashells all over the top of this darn thing." I said, "Oh, yeah, really?" He says, "Yeah, seashells. Not the fossils of seashells, they were the seashells. Not the fossils, actual seashells." Yes, this has happened before. When you see the Navy map, you'll see the following. Beginning at the Canadian border in Nova Scotia up there, and coming south, we have devastation typically 50 to 100 miles inland. The Navy veterans that I debriefed, they all said that the ocean will be as far inland as the Blue Ridge Parkway. Now, the Blue Ridge Parkway is a road that people like to drive, especially in the fall when the leaves are turning colors. It runs north-south, typically about 100 miles from the ocean. Typically. So coming down the East Coast, you're going to have the homes, the businesses, the hospitals, everything, where 75, 80 million people live, basically wiped out. Going down the coast, you've got South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. Florida's going to be gone. There will be no more Florida. Which brings up something else I'll mention in a moment, which is fascinating. The Gulf Coast, about half of Alabama, a little more than half of Mississippi, almost all Louisiana will be underwater. And Texas, devastation about 80 to 100 miles inland. West Coast, not quite so bad. It gets pretty high elevation pretty quick. There's an inland sea, what's going to become an inland sea. So the problem with California is that's where all the people live, is on the coast. What do we have in Los Angeles? 15, 20 million people? They'll be gone. And you got Washington State and Oregon. The middle of the country, the Mississippi River, will split the country in two. The Mississippi River will be 100 to 200 miles wide, a couple hundred feet deep. The government's already planning for this. The main new capital will be Denver. Talk about that a little bit more. The eastern capital and the minor capital would be Atlanta, Georgia, the highest elevation major city east of the Mississippi. The government is already splitting, like, for example, the U.S. Army. The United States Army NORTHCOM, Northern Command, is being split east-west of the Mississippi River. They've been doing that now for 8 or 10 years. There's a project that I'm working with my listeners on my radio show, and I could not possibly do this by myself. And Florida reminded me of it. We're recovering images from movies and television shows and now magazines showing continents with new coastlines. It all began about 3 years ago. One of my listeners found an image on the original Godfather movie, 1972. The Godfather's in the Vatican for a meeting with a high-level Vatican official. He's in a room maybe 1,000 or more years old, 20-foot ceilings, and there was a mural of the world, map of the world, on the wall. And it shows the continents with new coastlines. We didn't think much of it. We posted it on my website. Nothing happened until January of this year, 2017. One of my listeners was watching an American television show called Highway Patrol, starring Broderick Crawford. 1957, and we got the image on my website. The episode was titled Dead Hunter. And for you youngsters, I'll just give you a little bit of history here. In 1957 in the United States, there were 3 TV networks. Everybody in the United States had their choice of 3 TV shows any given evening. Highway Patrol was the top one in that time slot, black and white. So the homicide detective, Broderick Crawford, is in the office of an oil petroleum executive talking about the murder case. On the wall behind Broderick Crawford is a 3 by 5 foot map of North America with new coastlines. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've seen my map on my DVD, you're looking at it on that image there. Crystal clear and sharp. Broderick Crawford's forehead is right at Portland, Oregon. You can see it takes up the whole screen. Well, that was January 2017. That opened the floodgates, literally. The whole list, and it keeps growing, the whole list is posted at my website at thelibertyman.com. But they generally, they being the powers that be, they pick out the winners. We got Hunger Games. We've got Superman. We've got A Beautiful Mind. We've got Superman Returns, and many others. One of my listeners found an image on Look magazine. Now, Look magazine was a monthly publication, hugely popular in the States for decades. 1952, the Navy map is published. Now, the article was about UFOs, but the map they showed is the Navy map showing Florida gone, new coastlines, inland sea. That one kind of surprised me. I didn't expect to see an image going that far back to 1952, but it's right there. 1955, a children's show called Captain Midnight. The image is on there. I'm encouraging my listeners to find more images of continents with new coastlines, get those images to me, and as a thank you, they get their choice of any of my 5 DVDs. And they just keep coming in and coming in. It's a long list and keeps growing. I believe the term is predictive programming. We heard earlier today about the compulsion of the powers that be to give us a warning, to let us know what's going to happen. And that's what they've been doing. We've verified now since 1952 at least. At this point, I don't even want to speculate how far back in time we may go. 1952 surprised me. 1955 surprised me. There may be earlier ones. I don't know. We'll find out. It's a work in progress. How are we doing on time? Not too bad. I'll be back up here after lunch. We'll take a 10-minute break at noon, by the way. I have a radio show, Monday through Friday. The link to listen to it is at my website at thelibertyman.com. You can listen to the archives. If you listen here live in Europe, it would be late afternoon, I think, right? Late afternoon, 8 a.m. my time. Early evening. Early evening. But the archives are there and you can listen anytime you like. Every Wednesday, the first hour, I interview Professor McCanney. Now, unlike myself, Professor McCanney is a credentialed astrophysicist. He's taught astrophysics at the university level. He's taught mathematics at the university level. He's published one book, mostly dedicated to the topic of NIBIRU-Planet X, and what he calls a 60-page pamphlet, a small book, about surviving the consequences, and I believe about 9 other books at this point in time. Brilliant man, amateur archaeologist. And I encourage people to read all his books, but especially the one on Nibiru and his little pamphlet on how to survive the consequences of Nibiru, which we'll be talking more about this afternoon. I know we have doubting Thomases, and I encourage doubting Thomases. I don't want you or expect you to believe what I'm telling you without your own independent research. Here's some things you can do to convince yourself. We all use Google searches these days, right? There were press releases done for the following that you can recover. One is the CIA shutting down part of their operations in Langley, Virginia, and moving to Denver. Now, the original press release said, we want to disrupt the good old boy network that's been in place for so many decades, so we're moving all these people to Denver. Well, even their own people were laughing about that, so they changed it. The new press release said, we're doing it for operational reasons. National Security Agency, no such agency, Fort Meade, Maryland. There was a statement in a movie where they said that there was 19 acres, I believe, they said, of Cray mainframe computers underground at Fort Meade. That was a true statement. Enemy of the state, Gene Hackman. That was a true statement. The press release for moving Fort Meade, NSA, to Denver and to Utah was the following, which if you know about how the American power grid works, it's hilarious. They say the local electric provider, utility, cannot provide us enough electricity that meets our requirements at Fort Meade, so we're moving to Denver. That's hilarious, because electricity is bought and sold back and forth across the 50 states like any other commodity. You need more electricity, just buy it, and it's shipped in from wherever it needs to come in. So that's obviously a cover story, obviously. Do we have any scientists in the audience? Anybody who took chemistry in school? A couple? Okay. Now think about this. It's the end of World War II and you want to set up a place to work on really fun stuff like anthrax, for example. Would it be a smart idea to get maybe a 200-acre island 100 miles off the coast of the United States where it would be safe and you could play around with anthrax and other biological things? That's what they did. Right after World War II, they bought an island called Plum Island. Plum just like the fruit, Plum Island. And you can, once again, using Google Images, you can see an image of Plum Island. It looks like a 200 or 250-acre golf course with 5 buildings on it. The press release says, we ran out of room on Plum Island, so we have to move to the worst place you can imagine. Manhattan, Kansas, in the middle of the most important and productive agricultural real estate on the planet, Manhattan, Kansas. That's where they moved the biological testing facility. And by the way, Plum Island, I think is still for sale if anybody wants to buy it. No takers, right? These are press releases that anybody can find doing their own independent research. I've talked to any number of business people. They may have 10 employees, maybe 100. Let's say you've got 5,000 employees working at Langley, Virginia, and you want to move them to Denver, which is, probably 1,700 miles one way. Before you move the first person, you have to duplicate in Denver everything you've got at Langley, Virginia. The building, the workstations, housing for all these people and their families. An incredibly expensive undertaking, to say the least. But that's what they did. They did it because they have no choice. They did it because they know what's coming. Now, if it was going to happen 30 or 40 years in the future, why would you move people now who are going to be retired 30, 40 years in the future? Does that make any sense? No. You do it when you have no choice. Many people, and I found some who didn't know this, but it's been pretty widespread in the alternative media, even in the mainstream media. I've seen it in the mainstream media. The massive, brand new, shiny, empty cities in China, in the Gobi Desert. Nobody lives there. Not voluntarily. Beautiful, brand new cities that have nobody except custodial caretakers there. How many million people could live in these cities? 10, 30, 40 million. The ones who've been chosen to survive by the Politburo. Who would these people be? The most intelligent, most productive, the most athletic, most handsome, most attractive women to start over. And of course, the sons and daughters of the Politburo, doesn't matter how smart they are, they're going to be there anyway, right? When I ran for United States Congress in 1996, I remember news reports that the Russians were building underground cities in the Ural Mountains. I was talking to my team and I said, what's this about? The Cold War is over. Why are they spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build underground cities in the Ural Mountains? We didn't know. It didn't make any sense. Now it makes sense. It makes absolute sense. The Vatican Library, and you can find the press releases for this easily. The Vatican Library was closed, I believe, for 3 years, if I'm not mistaken, for a renovation. Now, the Vatican Library had been open every working day for centuries, many centuries. Closed for renovations. Now, we know that. Now it's back open. What we don't know is what the real reason was. I don't necessarily believe that it was closed for renovations. Typically, a library like that, they would close part of it, leave part open as they did their renovations. It is the most important repository of ancient documents on the planet, as far as I can tell. And the Vatican has survived lots of things the past 1,700 years, and they fully intend to survive this also. A friend of mine, he's a radio frequency engineer at a very high level. He was given a contract to set up two-way military-grade radio communications between a Catholic facility in St. Louis, Missouri, and the Vatican. This would have been about 1998. We didn't know about NIBIRU back then, at least I didn't. But now it makes perfect sense why they would do that. There's not going to be any press releases on that, by the way. That's very private.